Privet, Katila, ya, ni хорошо, because today we are going to be talking to leftists. Well, actually, this video is kind of addressed to everyone. So the title of this video is obviously a left-wing case for nationalism. And basically the reason why this video exists is try to explain our ideas to people who don't really agree with us. And if you are a leftist or someone who's on the left who's watching this video, I hope to offer you some ways in which you too can become a nationalist and how it can frame into a left-wing framework. And to those on the right, it's basically a guidance, like how to talk to someone who is on the left about nationalism, how to appeal to them, and basically how to talk to your relatives, friends, coworkers, who are left-wing, but you can't really make headway with them with your ideas because they think nationalism is like the big boogeyman. Now, full disclosure, I myself am a nationalist. I basically explained in my other video, The Right of Self-Determination, why I think self-determination and nationalism is both morally, legally, and just the correct stance to take. So I recommend you check that video out. To summarize, basically the peoples of the world have the right to preserve who they are. Turkey for the Turks, Japan for the Japanese, etc. Now, I myself have a lot of left-wing views, and I do come from a left-wing background. I supported Bernie Sanders in 2016. And just a few ideas to, I guess, show off my left-wing credentials, if you will. Like, why should I believe this right-wing dude? But here's what I still believe to this day, a single-payer or a universal healthcare system. I believe that climate change and environmental destruction in general is the second biggest issue for me. Check out my other video about the right-wing case for environmentalism if you're also an environmentalist, and how it can frame into how being right-wing is something, and you could be right-wing and environmentalist. I believe I'm anti-war, and anti-imperialism. I believe in workers' rights and have strong unions and with higher wages and such. So believe me, I'm one of you. I come to you if you are someone on the left with peace, and I just hope for you to understand that a lot of people I just want to hope to present the case for nationalism and how it could be fit into your worldview. Now, I don't really like the dunk on them culture that we have going on, so I'm not going to try to epically own with facts and logic certain people. I'm kind of more in this video going to explain the views and try to push them instead of trying to say why the other side is dumb or stupid. My goal here basically is to persuade you, if you're a left-wing, to see why nationalism is good and how it's a kind of fitting it within your left-wing framework, if you will. Now, with that being said, I think you already are a nationalist. Don't believe me? Well, you just don't know it yet. Have you ever argued, say, for the rights of the Palestinian people to have a state alongside that of the Jewish people? Or let's flip it. Let's say you are a Zionist and believe that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. You believe in any of those two ideas? How about with when this video has been released, the recent news of Trump's withdrawal from northern Syria? So a lot of emphasis on that news was put on the Kurds, which are a unique ethnic group, and how they should be rewarded for helping us fight ISIS. Do you support a Kurdish state? How about supporting Catalonian independence? Or does Scottish independence suit your fancy? Or perhaps you support a unified Ireland because the Irish people need to be united and free from British control and rule. Have you ever supported a sovereign Quebec independent state? Have you ever voiced support for the Free Tibet movement? Or does having a sovereign Uyghur state suit your fancy? Does it, something like that in China? Did you support, say, the Polish, Hungarian, and the people in the Baltic region rising up in the early 1990s against the Soviet Russian overlords and creating their own states, their own independent states? Maybe you're a swashbuckling anti-imperialist and totally approved of the people of Africa casting off the rule from the British and the French, etc., and creating their own countries. Did you support India's move towards independence, like Mahatma Gandhi? Do you support him? So, or in more recent times, perhaps you want America and the West to stop intervening in Arab politics and want them not to be influenced from foreign Western control. So like it or not, actually, if you support any of those ideas that I listed, or just one of them, congrats. If you agreed with any of them, congrats. you are a nationalist and believe in the idea of self-determination, meaning people have a right to protect their identities and rule themselves. It wasn't that bad. Now see it? Not that evil. Pretty easy, right? Common sense, even. Now, a lot of people have come under a spell in recent decades where they might fight for the nationalism of other people, like what I mentioned before. But when it comes to thinking about the preservation of their own people and country, it starts getting a little bit murky, and people get scared, as they think they're being exclusionary or even supremacist. And the previous examples show that we already embraced the fundamental principle of nationalism. For example, if I had to make an example of this, Kurds aren't Turks or Arabs. They want to preserve themselves with a state. And yes, that means they're exclusionary towards everyone. But you're like, well, that's bad, right? Well, no, not really. What's so bad of Kurds being like, look, we're unique, and that's what we want to maintain ourselves as a Kurdish people. There's nothing bad about that. And it's not supremacist in thinking. It's just that we want to preserve. It's not like we're better than Turks. We just want ourselves, And it's also, for example, a lot of people on the left support diversity. And if you're such a fan of it, then I encourage you to allow the people of the world to preserve their identities for generations to come so that the Kurds don't get wiped away from, mass immigration into their homeland, into their homelands and such. So if you support diversity, I recommend you support self-determination. Now, a lot of people say they might be patriotic, but not nationalistic, because that is somehow tied with militarism or supremacy or whatever slander has come over it. But that does not have to be the case. Nationalism is why we defeated Nazi Germany. The fundamental principle of self-determination is something that we charged against the Nazis because, for example, we realized that the Polish people have a right to exist, and the German idea of wiping out all the Poles and making the Polish lands German was genocide. And we were correct in that case against them. Nationalism is what spurred the peoples of Africa to liberate themselves from colonial rule, because they understood that they are fundamentally different from, say, the British, and they wanted to rule their own way for their people. Nationalism, like any ideology, can be a force for good and a force for ill. The way I like to explain it is that nationalism is the political implementation of patriotism. So I had a guy on Mr. Beat's YouTube channel who said that, quote, patriotism is love for your country and desire to see it improve. But nationalism is believing your country to be superior to the rest of the world, and fascism is the political implementation of nationalism. And I think this comment really demonstrates, I think, what people think. That's why they might think nationalism is toxic, even though they might be nationalists. In fact, ethnic nationalists, if in terms of supporting Palestinian independence or Kurdish independence, or a Kurdish state or a Palestinian state and such. And so I think this is what the public kind of views of nationalism. But the way I respond to why you should be a nationalist and not just a patriot is that, so patriotism is a feeling, I love my country, right? Nationalism is a political ideology where public policy is put in place to preserve and further and protect the nation and its identity. So that feeling of loving your country and its history and heritage, nationalism means putting patriotism into action, basically walking the walk, not just talking the talk, and making sure your country is put first. So that's that. Fascism is like when the government exerts complete control over the whole country from social to economic matters. Fascist states tend to be imperialist and more than often than not supremacist. So, but you could be a nationalist and believe in liberal democracy. You could be a monarchist, you could be a minarchist, like a libertarian. You could be a libertarian socialist and a nationalist, like the Kurds are. And yes, you could even be fascist and nationalist. But nationalism, in and of itself, isn't a supremacist idea. I will also add that nationalism, in and of itself, is a value, because it realizes that the peoples of the world have a right to preserve who they are. Japan for the Japanese, Turkey for the Turks, Poland for the Poles, England for the English. Does this appeal to you? Let me ask a simple question. If you go to, say, Seoul, South Korea, do you want to see Koreans? You want to hear the Korean language? Do you want to go there and embrace their customs and culture and see their unique parades and celebrating their own history and their own unique way of architecture and mannerisms? If you say yes, then congrats, you want what nationalists want. Feeling pride in your identity is perfectly natural. It's who we are as humans. It's just human nature, and don't let anyone guilt trip you otherwise. Think about the achievements of your country and the glories and triumphs that led to the country we have today, or to the country that you have today. It is your duty to fight for what you were given and to make it better and preserve for your own children. You're not alone. You're a part of the community. You have a unique identity. Embrace it and be happy. Human beings are just naturally tribal and want to preserve who they are. That does not mean you have to hate others. In fact, I would argue having this virtue makes you want all the people of the world to be able to live in peace and harmony, and preserve who they are. Also, self-determination of people is a value. Why should we preserve a people's homeland and their continued existence and culture? I hear people say, like, why preserve it? Who cares if Africa, let's say if Somali becomes Arab, right? Who cares, right? Well, now, first of all, I think we all agree that's an asshole-ish thing to say. It's just self-evident. But even factually, here's what I say to people: say, who cares if England is not English, for example? So I call it the essence of a nation. A lot of people think that your nation is just a random patch of dirt. That's why they don't really care if it changes, because it's just dirt. But we know for a fact it's not just dirt. Let's take the nation of Hungary. What makes this place different from anywhere else? The Hungarian people who are different from Russians, Turks, Arabs, etc. The Hungarian language is the spoken tongue in the land. Hungary has a unique geography. The Hungarian culture and customs. It has a Christian and humanist tradition. All these things together make Hungary Hungarian. It's kind of in the name. And if the land that holds Hungary today spoke Russian, had Russians, celebrated, say, Orthodox Christianity, then it wouldn't be Hungary anymore. Even if the state is still called Hungary, it would just simply be Russia. Also, for those on the right, when I recommend you talking to someone who's really deep in the left-wing rabbit hole, I would recommend trying to appeal to their nationalistic instincts that they already kind of have, but don't mention like Western European countries, and especially don't mention Germany, because then they kind of get off to Nazis and all that. Try to talk about like Palestine or Kurdistan or Free Tibet or anti-imperialism in Africa and such. And if you want to kind of move it towards like countries that they might not know, like Estonian like independence from the Soviet Union or Hungarian, something that they might not, because if you mention like a Western European country, they think you're just being like a white nationalist, and that's a no-no. So just kind of maintain, when you're talking to a left-wing person, try to appeal to them by not mentioning kind of a Western European country, just for the sake of trying to get them on board on the virtue itself. So my next argument for a lefty on why you should be a nationalist, besides you already basically believing in it, is, so let me ask a question. Do you like the welfare state? Do you like the working class? So if so, it is imperative that you should be a nationalist and support your government's right to restrict immigration and see who can come in. It's a famous quote, but you either have a welfare state and a strong border, or no welfare state and no border. You cannot have both. You cannot have both. So what makes the Scandinavian countries so utopia is not just pure economics. There's a cultural mindset to it. There's a culture mindset to it. A social contract, if you will, that for the betterment of society and nation, they give a little bit of their money for the sake of their countrymen. The sake of giving up a little bit for the sake of a better society is pivotal. Not just so that people can provide welfare, but for things for things like overcoming like a foreign enemy, to cross like the frontier for your country, to experiment and do something greater than yourself. The forces of national solidarity and connection to your homeland are what makes these huge human achievements possible. Love of your people and nation is one of the biggest drivers of change and greatness. It's been shown that homogeneous societies, are excellent at providing for that solidarity. People feel more engaged in their community. They feel more at peace. They vote more. They're more willing to give to charity. There's more social cohesion. They trust each other more. Essentially, the reason why you get a welfare state is because people trust each other. They know each other. They are willing to sacrifice for a common good. Unlike in diverse countries where people start thinking more along tribal lines and aren't willing to pay, say half their income in taxes because it might go to someone else. So for a welfare state to function, you need a high trust, high cohesion, homogeneous society for maximum efficiency in your welfare state. Additionally, bringing in large scales of immigrants and you don't control who comes in, you undercut the wages of your native workers. There is a reason why massive multinational corporations are the ones wanting us to become a more globalized world. You know why they want that. They want cheap labor, they want to outsource production, and they want a tax dodge. So, if you want to be opposed to these multinational corporations, as you guys always are, you have to, embrace the local and the nation. Think of it this way. If a company has a job opening and there are, say, 10 companies competing for 8 workers, well, they have to raise their wages and benefits so they can attract you over the other companies. If there are now, say, 15 workers, while the pressure is off because the pressure is now off because now the workers are competing for the jobs, and the more workers there are, the more the companies can pick and choose who they can hire. And now it's basically the company is like, hey, I only have this one job, and there's 5 of you. Who's willing to work for the least? And that's what happens when an American computer programmer who might be worth $120,000 now has to compete with an Indian programmer who has to work for $80,000. It might be like $80,000 a year might be great for that Indian computer programmer, but not so great for the American computer programmer. So they have to accept low wages from from a low wage country. So you have to support strong borders and a strong nation to support the native workers there. And also in this era, there's a big question that the left wing is asking, and that is, why is right-wing populism on the rise? I mean, there's a lot of left-wing parties who are promising big gains and big welfare, right? But why is right-wing populism on the rise throughout the West? To answer this, you need to reframe kind of the way you think of human nature, or the way the left-wing people, the people on the left think of human nature, or I should say, modify how you approach the people at large. So you stand for the oppressed, poor, and working and middle classes. They aren't just so-called class conscience, which is a discussion for another time. But I will agree that helping the working class with benefits is something that they like. They are more than just economic units. It's not just materialism. The history of the world isn't all about the material. It goes far beyond that. These working class workers, these middle class, these poor people, they have an identity. They are bound to their heritage and their way of life. This is why they vote for right-wing parties, even though a lot of them might not provide as much benefits to the working class than the left-wing parties. The people that the left wing claims to want to represent, are connected to their land. They cherish their country, their identity, and they know deep down, even in our Western countries, that they want to preserve it. And since the so-called far right are the only ones talking about it, and the left are calling them all privileged and racist, that's why that's why they vote right. Human beings and the spirit of life is much more than just jobs or wages or working conditions. And while those are really important, and that's a separate lesson for the right wing to not ignore those conditions, the left wing, my dear lefty friend, you need to understand that people naturally want to preserve their culture and identity. And lastly, I wanted to talk about nationalism in terms of how this can be a great boom for the environmental movement, which is seen in modern politics as a left-wing cause, even though I argue environmentalism should be a right-wing idea in another video of mine. Now, as someone who was studying biology, there is a term called a carrying capacity, in which an environment can only hold so many people of one species, and when there is an increase in competition for resources, people will be just increasingly tribal and will fight over resources. This can happen with anyone, but when people so different from each other occupy the same space and resources start running out, like, say, clean water, destruction will come. It might be all good now because we're filled with abundance, but when this charade falls down, do you think this diverse society will be kept together? Nationalism ensures nations can control who comes in, and it protects the fabric of society. There is a big debate going on, and there's a big debate going on, like, oh, how can we best regulate someone's life? Oh, how can we make sure this person how can we be sure that this person's transportation options reduce the carbon footprint? Or how can you regulate their diet or energy spending habits? Or instead of fretting, fretting over all that stuff, why don't we just not invite any other people into the country? Also nationalism gives environmentalism a stake in our land and soil. If you care for your nation, if you start thinking about the long-term effects of environmental destruction on your homeland, then you might already have the ethos of nationalism. You just might not know it. If you don't think long-term, if you just don't care for our land, why should we protect it? Nationalism is what gives a strong moral foundation and a strong case to protect the environment. Which is why I also argue that the left-wing view of just thinking more broadly about the globe instead of thinking about the stake in your soil and your land, I think that's why I think having a right-wing nationalistic point of view is better for the environment than just a left-wing one. Nationalism has, also allowed marginalized people to rise up and finally claim their liberty and freedom, like in Ireland or in Africa. And nationalism is what we can use to be anti-war. What right do we have to enforce our will on another country? Because it's the people of those other countries that have a right to control who they are. This feeling people have of wanting foreign troops out of their country is a nationalist feeling. And so, being anti-war and imperialism is just yet another reason to be a nationalist. So with all these arguments laid out bare in front, I hope I convinced you that nationalism is the moral answer, and that this is actually the left-wing case for nationalism is very strong, and I hope I dispelled some notions about what nationalism, is and is not. And I hope you also check out my right to self-determination video to get more why on a more detailed part for nationalism. And now that you finished watching this video, I presume you understand why, as a left-wing person, it is not only logical but outright certain that nationalism as a virtue and ideology is something you must embrace if you truly value the things that you claim you do, such as, in the environment, workers, and the oppressed people around the world. So that has been a way to, I guess, a left-wing view on nationalism, or how to, I guess, talk to a leftist about nationalism. And I hope you enjoy this video. I hope you also, give it a thumbs up and leave a nice comment on what you guys thought. Share it around if you wish. I'm not really a big YouTuber right now. And I hope and if you thought I did just a spectacular job, I hope you also check out my Patreon. So aim high, wander on, from America with Russian love.